Welcome to Crash Course in Commercial Real Estate. We converted our in-house training program to a podcast to teach you prospecting, negotiation, business planning, and other fundamental skills to become a successful commercial real estate agent. And now, here's your host, Brady Collier.
All right, welcome back to Commercial Real Estate Training. I'm Brady Collier. I'm in Lubbock, Texas, commercial real estate broker. I'm training Shannon here on commercial real estate. And today I've asked a longtime friend of mine, Taylor Tucker, to join me. And if you've seen some of our videos, we're pacing together what is commercial real estate. And this episode is about commercial real estate's a big industry. And when people think of it, they think of it in a very limited way based on their exposure. And when you think residential, it's basically just houses. But when you get into commercial real estate, you have retail shopping centers, you have office buildings, industrial warehouses, production facilities, you have apartment complexes, you have golf courses. There's all these different types of commercial real estate, and they all fall under the banner of commercial real estate. And so in this episode, what is commercial real estate? We're taking an office guy, an industrial guy, and we're asking him how their business is different from another commercial real estate agent who maybe specializes in something different. And so, Taylor, thank you for joining me, by the way.
You're welcome. Glad to be here.
Yeah. Of all of the transactions that you've done, how many of them, you're a multifamily broker,
Right.
How many of your transactions have been multifamily or land for multifamily?
Oh, goodness. 95+%. I mean, I don't know exactly, but vast majority.
Almost every single
Yes.
deal you've ever done.
Correct.
And then I have told them in previous episodes back when you and I were working together for several years that we averaged 4 to 5 transactions a year.
Right.
That was a decade and a half ago. And so now how many transactions would you average per year? We just went through a global pandemic. And so I don't know how you want to look at it, if you look at your last 10 years or whatever.
Not going to include 2020. But our team does, if we're just talking, probably somewhere in the 20 range.
20 deals.
Right around there.
Okay. And so apartment complexes so the focus of this episode is going to be how is selling an apartment complex different than selling, for example, retail shopping centers or industrial warehouses or whatever. And so we're in Lubbock, Texas, for those who don't know. It's a small, not even considered by many a tertiary market way out in the panhandle of Texas. So we're about 300,000 in population. So of your multifamily deals, how many of them geographically are within a couple hundred miles of here as a percentage?
Probably 70%.
Okay. Mm-hmm. And then if you had to guess, and not putting you on the spot to say an exact number, but just a range, the average deal size of a multifamily transaction, because we're starting to frame in for Shannon to think about the multifamily industry is very different than, for example, office leasing. The average office lease in Lubbock, Texas, because you're working with small companies,
Sure.
like 1,500 square feet. And so you can back from 1,500 square foot office lease and 6% of 5 years at $25 a foot or $20 a foot
Sure.
or whatever. It's a very small transaction size. But then, for example, Scott Womack in his office may do, how many deals does Scott do? Like 100 deals.
200
deals a
crazy,
year.
yeah.
He just does a crazy number
Right.
of transactions, 200. But some of them are very small. Some of them are very substantial.
Yeah.
You're doing 10 to 20 deals, whatever it may be, 20 deals. And then what's the average transaction size in your industry?
So in my industry is maybe different than what we do.
Yeah,
So
specifically speak about West Texas.
Right. So again, it's kind of broad. We've done transactions in our office. We kind of focus on about 16 plus units, but our main focus is 16 to 200 units is kind of our sweet spot. And so our average deal size is probably $5-ish million is kind of where we fall. In West Texas, we really target that mid-size range of properties. We believe that they turn over a little more often and have fewer long-term holders, and so we've done really well. And there's a lot of those properties in West Texas, a lot of properties. And so we mainly focus on secondary, tertiary markets around the state. And so we focus on, we do a lot of deals in Lubbock. We do more deals in Lubbock than, compared to other markets that we work in, but we work all over the state and region, including Oklahoma a little bit and eastern New Mexico. So, but all of those averaged, I would think, 5 million's like it's close.
That's
I
what I told
haven't
you.
really figured it out.
When I told you about my business the last several years of my business in multifamily space, it was 4 to 5 million. I think was the average that I told you. So that's consistent. And he's contrasting that with guys that are in Dallas, for example, being a primary market. You think of primary markets as port of entry markets, New York, Los Angeles, Chicago, those are all primary markets. And then there's the secondary markets. Most people consider Austin, San Antonio, million people plus markets. Some people even consider those tertiary markets. But in the major markets, you'll see what's called core plus assets, where they're brand new wrap product and they sell for how much? What a downtown Fort Worth or Dallas.
Hundreds a unit. I mean, depending on the product. I mean,
and so we're talking about 50, 60, $70 million.
Absolutely. Plus.
Per deal. Yeah, they're huge deals.
Yeah.
And it's the same thing for an office broker who's dealing in New York City. His average deal size may be $100 million. And so that's just not our markets out here in the space that we operate out here in Little Bitty West Texas.
Sure.
You can make a great living doing 20 deals a year, average 10 to 20 deals a year, averaging $4 to $5 million. That's a great living.
Mm-hmm.
Taylor, let's talk a little bit for Shannon, because I've told her if somebody calls me and says, hey, I want to buy an apartment complex, then I just shoot them over to you because I don't deal in that space. So when we're talking to her about framing in her business and her growth and the space, the commercial real estate as an industry, what would you say are differences with, say, I'd say office and industrial and retail? They have a lot of commonality to them. It's based on the leases that are executed, and there's a lot of commonality to those three. But multifamily, it's kind of its own little space. What makes it different than the other main categories?
I think there's a lot of things that make multifamily different than other property types. It seems in retail, it feels different to me when I hear some of the retail or tenant guys in our office talk about, the tenant rep has all the power in retail. But in multifamily, the principal agent has all the power. So one of the areas that's very, very different is when it comes to fees and cooperating fees with other brokers. Depending on the deal, there may be, for example, if a transaction has a 4% total commission, there may be maybe a 1% co-op fee on the buying side, maybe zero. More and more we're seeing no cooperation fee. And I know that was starting to trend back in the day when we were working with you, but it's everywhere now. And so that's a huge difference just on the brokerage side of things.
And let me interrupt you there. What percentage of your deals do you represent? We haven't really talked about on tape, at least, intermediary status, standing between a buyer and a seller, helping and representing them both, and the fiduciary responsibilities and all there. But on what percentage of your deals, just guessing, and all this is guesswork, because do you represent both parties?
Probably it's 80+%. I mean,
see, that's crazy. That would never happen in, for example, the retail space. You're putting your product out there and you're working with tenant reps all the time, and because the tenants are all choosing who their rep is, and they're going around trying to find the sites. So the tenant rep, the tenant is controlled by the tenant rep, which is why he said the tenant rep had all the power. So a guy would never do 80% if he was in retail leasing. He would never do 80% of both sides of the deal. So that's a substantial difference in your space.
Right. And it's really there's no one in multifamily that's a buyer rep. That would be a tough career. Yeah, we are starting to see more and more buyers getting paid by their clients. There's such demand in the market for property. It's a very, very, very strong market right now in multifamily. It's crazy, and so buyers are getting more aggressive, more desperate to find opportunity, and so they are starting to pay, buying side fees if necessary to just have more opportunity.
Yeah, to find the deals.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, and because it's so competitive, the listing agent doesn't have to really cooperate, because he knows if it's out there on Craigslist and LoopNet and all those sites, the people are going to come to him to make the offers. So he didn't have to offer a cooperating fee because he can get both sides. Taylor, so let me. So another thing that comes to my mind that's different about the space is the income. I mean, they're all valued based on the cash flow, the stream of cash flows that's coming out of the asset. But when you're looking at an industrial, an office, a retail lease, you're going to see 5-10 year leases. And so those asset classes, they can't move a lot whenever you're in an inflationary environment, which given all that the government's done over the last little bit here, we may be going into an inflationary environment. Whereas multifamily,
Right.
It's got a lot of flexibility on its values because what's the average term on the leases? I mean,
There's 6 months to a year.
Yeah.
Or there's a lot of month to month also.
So month to month on the shortest, a year on the longest. And so the owner of the asset's able to increase his rents as the market increases. Where on a retail lease, you're locked in for those 10 years. So even if the market's trending up very quickly and the owner's locked into 10 years of leases
Right.
at $25 a foot, he has no upward mobility to keep up with the market when
Right.
it comes to inflation.
Yeah, so you can get quick appreciation in your property value. So there's a lot of opportunity there in a hot market, but in a falling market, like we've seen in Midland and Odessa, where they've had oil drop, it's also a very scary thing because every month that ticks by, you're having more and more leases that fall off your rent roll, and you're having to drop your income by, 40%, 50%, to maintain occupancy. So a lot of the security that may be in other property types in a struggling market kind of goes away also with short-term leases.
So that's the flip side. And then the other thing about those leases is with the, for example, a retail shopping center, which we've talked a lot about on this training, is I pass all the expenses of the shopping center, the substantial expenses of the shopping center, they're all passed through to the tenant. They pay their percentage, their portion of common area maintenance, of insurance, taxes, and so on and so forth. But with multifamily, what expenses are paid by the tenant? Just the utilities.
Utilities, and that's varies from property to property also. And so, but that would be the only one on as far as pass through.
So when there's huge tax increases because of the appraisal districts raising everybody's taxes, retail shopping center, the owner doesn't has a very predictable, consistent income. It can't be eroded through expense increases. Whereas on a multifamily property, the owner's got all of the upside potential, but also all of the risk associated with expense increases. And that's a huge thing when it comes to utilities, insurance, and taxes, because there's things that even when we were working way back in the early days, black mold was an issue and insurance was going up. And so there's you've sold properties down near Houston, hurricanes hit. And owners.
Yeah,
so
it's a big deal. Insurance goes crazy. It's been going crazy for multifamily. That's probably, I think, one of the biggest differences from a brokerage standpoint, and just like daily responsibilities and things that you work on. Valuation for multifamily properties, I think, is much more complicated and complex than a lot of the valuations for shopping centers, because it's pretty simple. You have with the shopping center, it's NOI. There's not a lot of adjustments you have to make to that NOI. If you want to add in some reserves, or if you want to do things like that, you can. But there's only one or two adjustments you could possibly make. With a multifamily property, you're going line item by line item through that P&L and trying to figure out if it's capital that needs to be removed from expenses, if that's an expense that will stay with the next owner, or is this something that we'll have to add in because it's missing from the P&L for the next guy. There's so many. It's almost becomes like an art valuing these multifamily deals. It's pretty complicated.
And that's why I told you that if so in the past we've talked about generalists versus specialists. And is everybody in your office a specialist?
Yes.
How many agents do y'all have?
I think it's 9.
So they have 9 agents, and they all specialize in something. Whereas there's companies in town that have all generalists, and there's no specialist. But in the multifamily space, do you ever see you see generalists selling multifamily properties on the very lowest end of the product, where it's like going up from a duplex to a quadruplex to a very small apartment complex. Right. But in the larger assets, 225 unit, 80s vintage, walk-up garden style, do you ever see a generalist selling those assets?
Maybe 1 or 2 in 16 years.
Yeah, 1 or 2 large apartment complexes sold by a generalist, because respectfully, the generalist just doesn't have the skill sets needed to properly value and sell. And if they take the listing assignment, their life is miserable because all the questions that are coming are very specific. And you don't find a lot of crossover, do you, between an apartment investor and a shopping center investor? Most apartment people are apartment people.
Most of the crossover that's happened are multifamily investors that are leaving the industry to go to retire and get mailbox money in a shopping center.
And that's what people consider retail shopping centers or net leased assets, mailbox money, because you don't do anything. Right. Everything's on the tenant. Whereas an apartment complex, they don't manage it themselves, 220 units.
But even if they hire a third party, they're very involved. I mean, like no one, if you're an owner that's 100% dependent on your management company and you're wanting mailbox money, but typically those don't go well as the investors are looking for that type of opportunity to get involved and raise value.
They don't go well because those managers, their incentive is to keep the property really full because of the way that they're paid on a percentage. So they don't push rents. Sometimes they don't reinvest in capital. And so if you see a really detached owner who hasn't been very active in an apartment complex, normally his asset's been depleted on capital, his rents are under market, and we call those value add investments.
Right.
Where somebody's going to buy it, invest a ton of capital, bring all the rents up to the market because they can turn those leases, they're 6-month leases, they can turn them really quick and they can add millions of dollars in value by infusing some cash and a really focused management strategy. Value add in retail is really hard because you got a 10-year lease and you buy it year 3. You got to wait 7 years to turn over that lease. So even if somebody's depleted the asset, value add in retail, it's a long game. Whereas value add in multifamily is 3-4 year. I mean, it can be as short as 1 or 2, but really it's a 3 to 4 year turnaround.
Most of the time we're seeing 4, but 3 to 5 is what is most common now. Yeah. It's longer than it used to be.
Okay. So recapping those things that we've talked about. Go ahead.
Yeah, no, I was going to say, it sounds like if I get a call from multifamily, I will be calling you. I've got a guy who can do this.
Great. I think another big difference, by the way, do we have time for another?
Yeah, go ahead.
Is the buyer for multifamily actually who are buying these assets is very different from retail and office. And these, most of the time, the buyer that we're seeing for retail and office and industrial, they're more of individuals for the most part. There are LLCs, obviously, but they're behind those LLCs. There's not as many, for the most part, syndications with GPs and LPs and investment structures. I would say 80 to 90% of every multifamily property that's purchased today, it has some investment structure behind it and then the buying entity. So they're syndicating, they're syndicators buying up everything right now, and they're super aggressive, and there's a lot of bad underwriting going on, and so that's fueling. It's really hard to use the underwriting fundamentals that I learned with Brady that we grew up on. They're almost completely absent today. It's crazy.
And he brings up a good point that the buyer pool of apartments, it's never, ever, ever, ever an owner occupant. I mean, it's like, that's almost impossible to have an owner occupant, whereas retail, industrial, and office, if I have a retail building on 50th Street, that could go for sale, that could go to an owner occupant who's going to put his retail business in there, or it could go to an investor who wants to buy it and lease it to a retailer. Same thing with an industrial building, same thing with an office building. You have owner occupants and you have investors who just want cash flow. But that's another difference in multifamily is that the buyers is 100% investors.
An under-occupied apartment would be a condo.
Yeah.
So,
which would make it not multifamily property.
Actually, that's not true. There's one property in Midland that an oil and gas company bought it, and they're filled with their employees. So in a way,
we can't consider Midland, Texas normative.
Yeah,
everything
you
about
can't.
it is
you can't.
not normative.
It's Mars. So.
Yeah. So so that's an overview of multifamily versus the other property types. You see generalists operating in this sphere. Taylor Bo couldn't join us. He was going to talk about land. So let's transition a little bit from multifamily, because you've brokered a bit of land, especially to multifamily investors, but you're in an office with guys who do it. So land, specialty, what other than office, retail, industrial, and multifamily, what are property types out there that people sell that they specialize in?
Well, over the years, we've seen everything from there's self-storage groups.
Yep.
There's I don't need, maybe I think they call it, they're not mobile home, but what do they call it?
Manufactured housing
group.
communities.
Yes, there's manufactured housing groups.
Hospitality
guys. I mean, we saw a guy in Florida that specialized in golf courses, and so we've seen another person that specialized in churches. We've
Farm
seen a
and
little.
ranch.
Yeah, farm and ranch is a very common one out here. That is,
and a farm and ranch broker would be different than like Bo, your brother
very
does
different.
land sales, and he does a lot of land. But even the farm and ranch broker is pretty different from the guy who's selling
It's
land.
very different. I would say they're different specialties. Yeah.
And it's the guy who loves ranches.
Oh yeah. Yeah, that was tempting back in the day. I'm like, man, that'd be fun.
Yeah.
But no, stuck with multifamily. I do think that it is very different from farm and ranch. Farm and ranch is a lot of the principles are the same, but from valuating the asset, it's very different. Development land is strictly on comps, around locally. There's a lot of things from minerals to water to, there are a lot of things that quality of the grass, different things adjust the value of farm and ranch. So,
cool.
I know when Bo has done those things, he's much more quick to. I mean, he can tell you exactly what your land's worth, a mile south of town, but he can't. It takes him a little while to navigate, a ranch in the hill country. That takes a little bit more work. It is very specialized.
Taylor, thanks for joining us today. Shannon, do you have any further questions for Taylor? All right, so in recap of everything, we've looked at office, industrial, we've looked at retail in depth, multifamily, commercial real estate industry. It's a huge industry, and it's the sum of all the income-producing assets across the United States. And so it's a very big industry, and almost all the time people are picking their lane and running in their lane, whether that's geographically through their market or through their property type. And so that is what is commercial real estate.